All right, we have the Unholy Three back together again. We have Josh Earl, Garrett Bugay, myself, Corban Ford. We are here continuing our talk on roster reconstruction. We talked a couple weeks ago. We had our first part of what you call a series here, talking about roster construction, and we did it primarily through the lens of the draft and what that looked like, common mistakes, the intricacies of building through the draft, BPA versus best player, or BPA versus fit, all of that. And so now we're kind of continuing that philosophical conversation, really more of a loose general talk around building teams concerning the other two avenues of team building. And that is specifically, of course, free agency and trades. And I definitely enjoyed this. I think I'm gonna enjoy this conversation as always with you two gentlemen. One, because this is the more of the transactional part that the common fans are in. You have the trade machines, you have the video games, you have, well, just get this guy for him, and why can't you trade Giannis, and or not, why can't you trade for Giannis, trade Alex Caruso for Giannis straight up, or something like that. It's always fun and kind of crazy with the pie in the sky thoughts there, but like there is a general serious conversation we had around the intricacies of building a roster around a big trade or around a huge free agency signing, and whether you have the infrastructure to support that player and put them in the best position for both them to succeed and your team overall to succeed. So I don't know who wants to kind of take it from here. We're just going to kind of kick it off and go from there.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that free agency and trades, in contrast to the draft, tend to be more open to like right now type perspective. With the draft, like we talked about, most of the time it's focused on, potential. Where do we see this player, down the line after some development? With free agency and trades, teams are still swinging for the fences when they can, but you see a higher percentage of free agent contracts and trades that are focused on like rounding out a team. So not just the like, we're trying to get our superstar or we're trying to get our secondary option, blah, blah, blah. You're also getting like, okay, well, we need somebody who's elite in this one particular skill set, and we can acquire them either with these assets in a trade, or maybe they're going to be an upcoming free agent and we can offer them a contract offer that maybe other teams won't.
Yeah, I think speaking to our last discussion on the draft, there's a lot of interesting things we could get into in terms of trades that involve, players that are veteran guys that have been in the league, traded straight up for draft picks. Of course, the real famous one would be the Spurs trading George Hill to the Pacers and getting the draft pick that became Kawhi Leonard. There's also the recent one with Memphis and Philadelphia, where Memphis ended up trading for pick 23, and they took, I'm blanking on
Roddy.
Yeah, David Roddy.
Yeah.
And in the process, lost a really valuable rotational guard, and they've been struggling with depth this season. So there's a lot of interesting ways to go about it. Like, the Spurs making that trade of a quality player for a draft pick ended up being a home run. And the Memphis deal seems to be something that has really hurt their team, at least in the present. So there's a lot of fascinating things that go into it. And, it also, involves a team's confidence level in not only the players that they have that they might be trading away, but then their confidence in their scouting for players on other teams, and also players in the draft that they might be trading to get a certain pick to select.
Yep. It's interesting you bring that up, because I guess I do want to talk. Like, let's start with, I guess, let's look at it first from the trade perspective, right? What are you looking at when you see trades being announced, or teams that are in the trade window? hey, this team's looking to acquire this X player. So like right now, the big player on the market or available is, of course, Zach LaVine, right? And so you have a list of teams that are potentially, circling around to kind of see the availability and if they have, the players to make that happen, where they should make that happen. You have teams like, the Philadelphia 76ers and the Los Angeles Lakers and, all sorts of teams. I mean, you have a lot of wild card teams too. I've heard Charlotte mentioned all these other squads kind of around. Yeah. Like as a wild card team. I think it was on No Dunks. It was a while ago. Well, a month ago. I mean, this sag has been going on for a second now. But like one thing I like to think is, okay, does that make sense? Obviously, it makes sense for the player on the team, obviously, or they probably wouldn't be recommended as like a potential destination spot. Now, how good is the fit? It depends, right? Like Zach LaVine on the 76ers is obviously going to look different than Zach LaVine on the Lakers, and that's going to look different than Zach LaVine on the Kings, right? But I also think it's important about like what does the team look like with the pieces they give up in order to get that player back, right? And how that works out. And I mentioned the Lakers because a couple of years ago I love this guy, but Lakers traded quite a few rotation level players that were really key to their championship run in 2020 for one big player in Russell Westbrook, who was a horrible fit, and we don't even need to go into that much. But just to show from a team perspective, yeah, you could make it, and yeah, in theory, it could possibly work, even though it's kind of dubious in my mind at that. But also, it's really important, not just what you're getting in return, but what you're giving up in the first place to make that trade come together.
Yeah, I think we should talk about like Zach LaVine and a potential move to the Lakers, because that's been a team that's been rumored that wants to upgrade. They do have a future draft pick at their disposal to upgrade, and we saw in the in-season tournament they're a team that's pretty good, obviously, and they made the Western Conference Finals last year. LeBron is looking really good, even at age 39. Anthony Davis had a monster performance in that tournament final. So they're a team that theoretically has some assets and some contracts now with the likes of like a Rui Hachimura that they could potentially include in a trade. But like Zach LaVine, I'm not a big fan of that for the Lakers, in part because you add him into the picture, and all of a sudden, what does that do to their defense, right? You got to factor in, yes, the Lakers probably do need to get a little bit better offensively. That's their issue right now. But at what cost, right? Like if they go from say 20th to 15th in offense, but drop from 7th to 15th on defense, it's probably not worth that improvement on one end of the floor. And then, yeah, Corban, you rightfully stated that they're going to have to not only trade draft assets, but some salary filler. And, if they trade the likes of Rui Hachimura and Gabe Vincent or something to get him, like, does that actually make the team significantly better? And we're not even getting into the idea of like Zach LaVine has dealt with a lot of injuries, and he could be unavailable at crucial moments.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
Josh, you have any thoughts?
I just think it's interesting that we're talking about trades as this kind of complex, nuanced thing because of trade-offs. I just find that fun. But because I think everything comes with trade-offs, right? And much like you guys are talking about with LaVine, like you said, Corban, LaVine is going to be worth a different value to different teams because of whatever context they're going to be putting LaVine into. And that includes what they would be sending out as well. So like the Lakers, for instance, yes, you could probably aggregate Vincent and Rui's deals to match salary. I imagine D'Lo would probably more likely be involved. But that's what the Lakers would want to give up. What would Chicago want in return for LaVine? Like the Lakers have the pick, but is Chicago wanting to have cap space early, or do they happen to like Rui Hachimura and are kind of more open to having some other like pieces that are longer contracts? Like the thing about trades, and for context for listeners who don't know much about me, I used to teach a class on scouting and being a GM with an NBA Executive of the Year for a couple of years. And before that with some people who had been a GM and like prominent scouts and stuff. And it's amazing how much people think trades are easy. Like Corban, in the intro, you were like, hey, people love to talk trades. We got the trade machine. We got video games. Trades are not as simple as the media and the fans and stuff make it out to be, and video games make it out to be. For one, you're not actually getting 29 offers. Like you're not. There are some teams that are just simply not interested. There are other teams that maybe due to past interactions with your organization don't actually want to work with you. And the other element of it that makes it super complex is, the idea is you just get these two teams to agree on these specifics and a deal is done, right? But within each team, you got to get the key shareholders to agree on what you're willing to offer in the first place, let alone, getting full agreement on the proposed finalized deal. So you got the ownership, depending on how hands-on or hands-off they are. You got the coaching staff to some degree have input. Sometimes the star players on the team have some input on this. Then you have not only the GM, but like the scouting staff, the analytics staff. Like there's a lot of people that just for one team, you have to get collectively aligned to say like, this is what we're willing to send out and this is what we're trying to get back. Then you have to have that same thing happen with the other team. And then both teams have to agree on the actual terms of the deal. And it then has to follow the NBA rules and bylaws and the CBA rules. Like trades are not nearly as easy as we're led to believe by the 24-hour media cycle, by video games, and by things like the trade machine and that sort of stuff.
No, that's true. I think there's, like you said, there's a lot of nuance there, and I guess we can kind of dive into. We brought up a few topics here. First, if we go circle back to the Zach LaVine deal, right? Like, or the Zach LaVine conversation for the Lakers, I personally wouldn't do it, right? Like, you can make it work. The Lakers' offense isn't really great in the half court, I mean, because the lack of shooting. The go-to play for the Lakers is, of course, LeBron James, AD pick and roll, right? But because at this stage of their career, LeBron is a 4 and AD is a 5, you're not really getting a ton of mismatches off of that, right? And the outside shooting by the Lakers has been pretty bad. It's been that way for the last couple of years, despite the plethora of shooters that in theory they have right now, right? So I could see where a guy like Zach LaVine, they give the ball to and he can create something out of nothing potentially, would be, intriguing. At the same time, yeah, major trade-off defensively. If the Lakers are just getting their healthy guys back and they're making a major impact on that in the floor. We saw what they did with Indiana. It wasn't the fact they blitzed Tyrese Halliburton as much as who they blitzed him with, right? You have a guy like AD in the back line. You have a guy like Jarrett Vanderbilt, all arms and defensive acumen, right? You have a guy like Cam Reddish, who's really come to his own, leveraging his athletic prowess on the defensive side of the ball and getting deflections. And I think leading the league in steals in the month of November. Like, you have all of this happening. You have one of the greatest, guys in sussing out schemes and plays before they happen in LeBron James. So, like, defensively, they've really been good, right? Or at least they've been better as they've been healthier. And you send a bit of that out. I mean, you shift the roles a bit. You send a bit of that out, potentially, and who goes out of, if you're making room, even bring him up for Taurean Prince. If you're trading Taurean Prince, if you're obviously making room for Zach LaVine by limiting Taurean Prince's minutes, and you send out Rui Hachimura and D'Angelo Russell, like either way, defensively, there's an impact there. And then also offensively, like, for example, D'Angelo Russell has been great for this locker room. Like, you hear, the things he's saying, and it's been that way all season long. Like, Cam Reddish, Austin Reeves talking about like the stuff that D'Lo's saying. You have the clips, between the lines of him talking with LeBron and schemes. Like, that sort of locker room presence is a big deal. And a reason I go to that, I'll even go a little blast from the past, but the 2014 Indiana Pacers, they ended up, making some moves that really messed up the team chemistry when they brought in Andrew Bynum, that made Roy Hibbert feel threatened from the big man position, and they brought in Evan Turner that came and made Lance Stevenson feel kind of upset, and that subtly messed up their chemistry. And in losing, in bringing in Evan Turner, they lost not only Danny Granger, but they also lost Orlando Johnson, who had the pleasure of meeting last 2 years ago in Summer League, and he's a great guy. And honestly, that's what the Pacers said. Like, Orlando Johnson was a great person to have around. Danny Granger was the old vet. Yeah, he wasn't playing like he was, but he was able to give us like that experience and the know-how. And you bring in a guy in Evan Turner who's not a bad guy by any stretch of the imagination, but like, it does sour a little bit of, you know, the locker room in terms of, wow, okay, Lance, he plays the exact same style I play, right? He's not the guy that was kind of fitting in like those guys did. So there's something to be said for locker room chemistry as well. And so, yeah, just putting a bow in that before I throw it over to Garrett. That's why I wouldn't want that trade to happen. Like, yes, the Lakers are getting healthy. Let's see how it is. All of that. Is the move possible? Should a move happen? Possibly. But as it is right now, the chemistry is building, I think, right? And I think there's so much that can be upended by a trade for a player who, while talented, I don't think is a demonstrative upgrade over the pieces that they already have.
Yeah, Corban, those were great points in terms of and you know, something that Josh was bringing up, that there's a lot of things to consider when making trades. Like, the locker room context is definitely one of those things. You know, again, speaking to the Zach LaVine trade idea, I find it fascinating because there's this idea that, you know, to be a championship caliber team, you've got to kind of be borderline top 10 on both ends of the floor, right? That's kind of the theory of it. And right now the Lakers are, you know, when right, they could be one of the best defenses in the entire league, if not the best. But their offense is like in the 20s, you know? So the thought of a trade would be, okay, maybe we sacrifice a little bit on defense and become like the 8th to 10th, and we can bring our offense to be 8th or 10th, and then, you know, we might be a better team. But that can go sideways really quick. A good example of this, and kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, was the 2015 Dallas Mavericks, I believe. So they had one of the best offenses in the entire NBA. They had, you know, Jameer Nelson running the show, Dirk Nowitzki, Monte Ellis, really good offensive basketball team. Tyson Chandler was back there catching lobs. And then they made a trade for Rajon Rondo. And the thought process was, we're going to improve the defense, right? And even if our offense takes a slight step back, you know, that will make us better in the long run. I think a big issue is that Rajon Rondo wasn't actually the good defender that they were trading for, because he had some injuries and wasn't quite the player that he was in his prime with Boston. But it really, you know, so they didn't really actually improve that much on the defensive end. But then offensively, they took a huge step back, because all of a sudden they had a non-shooter running the show, and you're taking the ball out of the hands of Monte Ellis and out of the hands of Dirk Nowitzki and putting it into the hands of a lesser offensive player. So, you know, you can understand the rationale of why Dallas wanted to make a move, because that team as constructed probably wasn't good enough to win a championship prior to that trade. They got worse. But, you know, you can understand why they wanted to make a move to try to propel themselves, but it can backfire. It can backfire pretty easily.
I think you had a point to share, Josh.
And speaking of the various like nuances and trade-offs that you have to consider when making a deal, the other thing is that offense, I think at the time, was trending as like the best, the most efficient offense in NBA history to that point in the season. And a lot of it was due to ball movement. Now, Rondo is a very accomplished passer, but he is somebody who pounds the hell out of the ball until he can make the pass he wants to make. He's not a ball mover. He's a passer. And on top of that, Rick Carlisle, especially at the time, very closely held the reins. He didn't allow a lot of playmaking freedom to his point guards. Rondo is one of the smartest NBA players that we've seen, and also has the ego to match it and wants to run his own stuff, right? that was never going to work. It was never going to work simply because that disconnect alone, and the fact that, like Garrett said, the defense he wasn't going to change their defense that dramatically, but he was going to potentially derail the key element of why their offense was working so well, which was the free ball movement amongst the players. And Rondo, again, fantastic passer, but not a ball mover.
Yeah, and like I said, it upset the chemistry. I remember that team. I'm glad you pointed out, Garrett. I was getting excited, behind the camera, because I remember playing with that team in 2K and watching, just loving the spacing, right? Big Monte Ellis fan here. And the spacing Monte Ellis had, with pick and rolls with Dirk, and you had Jameer Nelson shooting a three at a solid clip along the wing or at the three, or at the corner. Like, you had spacing there, and that was able to leverage into rim runs for Tyson Chandler, and the spacing there where it wasn't congested. It was beautiful free flowing basketball.
Dirk Nowitzki's probably final really, really good season.
Exactly. And to basically ruin it that way, not only do you upset the chemistry, like Rondo, by all accounts, was just kind of trying to think of the word, aloof. Let's just go who's aloof. Friction with the coach, all of that just messed it up. But also the basketball talent, skill set as well. Jameer Nelson wasn't half the playmaker that Rajon Rondo was, but he was twice the shooter, I'd say, and really did a good job of spacing for some Orlando Magic teams, the previous half decade. And he did, I'd say, Josh, move the ball and kind of keep that going. So yeah, he didn't have to be a guy to make the super advanced level reads, but he could make the solid play that would either give to the hockey assist or just a straight up pass to the finish. And that did upset the chemistry totally and led to a flame out in the first round, right? So yeah, I agree with you there. I think that is something to be said, that locker room element. And there's other examples I'm sure we can bring up and might pop in as we're talking, that kind of lend itself to the important note of, chemistry matters.
Yeah, and again, you can't just focus on, okay, what skills or what talent level does the player we're bringing in have? You have to focus on, okay, possession by possession, how does this change what our team does, right? Like the LaVine acquisition. Yes, he's a very talented offensive player, and I would venture to guess that he would make the Lakers offense at least marginally better. But it's not as simple as just saying, add Zach LaVine's offensive skill to the Lakers, and then they're going to get that much better, because you're probably replacing some LeBron offensive possessions with Zach LaVine possessions. You're replacing some Austin Reeves possessions with Zach LaVine possessions. And LaVine has always been, a pretty poor off-ball player, despite the fact that he has a skill set to be pretty good in that area. He's just never really prioritized that aspect of his game. So, I always like to bring this up, and I know we were going to discuss the 2016 free agency class as well, but the Evan Turner acquisition with the Portland Trailblazers, the reason I hated it as soon as that happened was that, not only is Evan Turner not as good as Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum on the offensive end, but he's going to actually be taking the ball out of their hands to be worse than them. So you're replacing superior offensive possessions with inferior offensive possessions. So it's something that you got to factor in, not only with the guys you're sending out, but the guys that you still have on your roster that are going to be out there, and how that player impacts them.
Yeah, I agree. I think before we even go to that 2016 free agency, because we are going to dive into that, and I think it's going to be a doozy to have that conversation, unless you're a Lakers fan like myself. But going to the trade, so I think another element that we touched on, but wanted to dive in a little bit more and get y'all takes on, is really just about how other teams see the trade. Because obviously Josh was talking about it's so hard, to make a trade, because it's not just the game where, it's the AI that you're dealing with, or, in your own trade machine where you're like, okay, this works and this works, so let's make it happen. There is another team and how they evaluate a player. And I think back to when I was in sports business classroom and we were in charge of Oklahoma City Thunder, and how we were going around we were a team, this is 2020, after the Russell Westbrook trade. So we're trying to start fresh, get new players, this and that. And we were trying to negotiate with the Golden State Warriors, who had just acquired Jonathan Kuminga. And we were like, we want Jonathan Kuminga, and we'll give you a 2024 Clippers first-round pick that's already protected. And if it doesn't convey, it'll go into 2 second-rounders. And maybe we'll throw in Lou Dort. And the Warriors are like, sure, like, we don't really care if Jonathan Kuminga, like, take him. And it was like, wow, like, but also back then, John Kuminga's ceiling was, I mean, and it still depends on how you feel about him now, 3 years later. At the time, we were like, wow, we got a steal. And like, what were the Warriors thinking? And mind you, we had GMs that were there thinking, well, we had like Ryan McDonough and others who were like, yeah, that's interesting. Like, did a bit of business for the Thunder. Not really sure why the Warriors would do that. Fast forward now, and it depends on what you look at, Lou Dort, and how you look at Jonathan Kuminga. But like, yeah, one team goes, this is what we want. Another team has to look at their, internal, the scouting department, their executives, and go, okay, we value this player this way. We're not a big fan of this player, whatever the case may be. And that is also a big way of a big potential wedge in why a trade doesn't happen, or a big reason why a trade does happen with either, spectacular or disastrous effects.
The reason why trades are difficult to get everybody on the same page is exactly that. Like, all value is relative value. So, like, in our previous discussion about the draft, the number 1 pick itself is not valuable. It's having the first choice from the largest pool of players available. That's what's valuable, not the historic precedent of who was drafted with that pick and stuff. And it's a similar thing with trades, and where it sometimes falls apart is you value these players or these assets, these picks or expiring contracts differently than the other team does. And you also might be suffering from like a finite perspective versus an infinite perspective, where a finite perspective, you're trying to win. Like, this is a single thing, like, we're going to win this trade. And an infinite perspective is we're trying to keep playing. We're trying to keep going. And so another thing that you see, particularly in the media and fans and, video games and stuff like that with trades, like, I got to win this trade. Yeah, except when you win a trade, when a trade is really bad for the other partner in the deal, they probably won't work with you going forward, at least for a little while. And now you have one less option in future deals. And if somebody from that staff goes on and takes a job somewhere else, you might lose another opportunity with that organization as well. So, like, you have to, my good friend, may he rest in peace, Mark Workentine, he used to say, your goal is a 60-40 trade, because you need to write their press conference. You have to write their winning press conference speech. This is why we won the trade. You have to write that for them. You have to be in their mindset just as much as in your own. Because if you're not, why the hell are they going to want to do your deal? If you're just offering them, flotsam and maybe like a okay pick. Like, do you guys remember when Danny Ainge was boasting about how we offered 4 picks to move up to number 10 with Miami and take Justice Winslow? Yeah, if you actually looked at the picks that he offered, they were all bad picks. Like, none of them were even remotely close to lotto, let alone top 10. Mm-hmm. And so you have to not only factor in what that team wants and needs. Like, again, you have to write their victory speech. You also have to factor in, obviously, your own. And that's why Mark always said, like, 60-40. You want it to be a good deal for them and a great deal for yourself. And to do that, again, you kind of have to put yourself in their shoes as well. And that's also why, like, trades can be difficult to do, because some teams are in a different context than your team. So, like, you might be a veteran contending team that's starting to trend down. You want to start a rebuild potentially, or at least get cheaper. there's a rebuilding team that wants to get into the playoffs after 3 years of really bad basketball. And so their needs actually align with what you're willing to give up, and what they're willing to give up actually aligns with what you want to get. And that's how a deal actually comes to fruition.
Yeah, and Josh, when you mentioned the whole, you've got to sell basically the other team's press conference, the first trade that came to mind was the recent Domantas Sabonis Tyrese Halliburton deal, right? And if you're just going to ask me, like, if I have to just say who won the trade, I'm gonna lean Indiana because I think they got the superior player. But you could at least make an argument as to why Sacramento did it, and how it's helping them at least in the present. And Domantas Sabonis. I should say they had Fox and Halliburton, and there's only one ball, right? And they didn't have a ton of talent in the front court spots, so it makes a little sense there, right? To free up Fox and then add some talent at the center position. And for Indianapolis, it was the exact opposite scenario. They had Miles Turner and Sabonis that were kind of an overlapping skill set there in certain respects. So clear some room for Miles Turner to do a little bit more on the offensive end, as we've seen this year that he's capable of doing. And then you get some more talent in the backcourt. And we've seen a lot of, I think that's where I think trades can maybe be the easiest for franchises, is when certain teams have too much talent at a certain position, and then they can say, well, you've got too much talent at a position of need for us, and we've got too much talent at a position of need for you, so let's make a deal. Another trade that I remember as far as that's concerned is the Kevin Johnson, Larry Nance trade back in the 80s, where the Cavs had both Mark Price and Kevin Johnson. It's like, well, we could use some more talent at the 4 spot, and we can, in the process, free up Mark Price to be our, all-star point guard. And it worked out for both teams, because Phoenix then got a really solid point guard to pair with Charles Barkley and on that finals team in 1993.
No, I definitely like that. Like, I think those are some of the rare win-win trades that are really, really solid. I think another one also in the 80s is the 1988 Knicks Bulls trading Bill Cartwright for Charles Oakley. Like, that worked out for both. It worked out. Like, the Knicks had Cartwright, a former all-star center, but guess what? They also just drafted Patrick Ewing a little bit ago, and they need a power forward next to him. Oakley would, average double-double with the next 10 seasons, and was even an all-star with the Knicks. And then Cartwright and Grant were part of the starting front court on both teams that won the championship, 91, 92, 93. So, another one that was, a really solid trade for both. And I think there's something to be said for that, And then another one I even bring up in the 2000s, Memphis and the Lakers. Memphis trading Pau Gasol. In that 2010, listen, I'll make that argument, because at the time, it looked like a landslide victory for the Lakers, and it makes sense. Pau Gasol was an all-star, a very skilled big man. Marc Gasol was playing in the Spanish league, and, didn't know he was going to the NBA. But then, guess what happened, right? Gasol helped the Lakers get to the 2008 NBA Finals. Then they were going to 2009, 2010. And then Marc Gasol, basically the greatest player in Grizzlies franchise history in my mind. I don't know how you feel about John Morant. I'm just kidding. Greatest player in Grizzlies franchise history. Passing his brother nearly all of the categories statistically, spent 10.5 years in Memphis, made 3 all-star teams, 2 all-NBA teams, defensive player of the year in 2013. Should have been LeBron's, but still. Bottom line, you got a guy who became your franchise player. Yeah, you didn't win a championship. It's Memphis. I don't think they're going to win with Pau Gasol. And the Lakers got somebody they need as an immediate upgrade to help them compete and win championships. That's my line.
It was still a horrible trade, Corbin.
It worked. Listen, it ended up
worked
being
out.
a win-win.
It worked out, but that's like hindsight is 2020. You have to remember, at the time, Marc Gasol was not considered very highly. He was taken in the 50s, I think, in the second round, and it was more like Memphis kind of liked him, but I feel like it was choose among these options for a salary filler to make this work. But anyway, I don't want to get
I was about to say,
arguing
I
about that type of
yeah,
trade.
no,
But
for sure. Let the people decide. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, yeah, the people decided, Corbin. They all said it was a terrible trade.
No, at
even
the
people
time.
who love Mark. Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
But time is an element of trades and trade discussions, and part of the problem we have with the perspective on trades in team building is how the media immediately we have to have trade grades. Who won the trade? You don't know. Like it could be something that plays out. Honestly, I try to look at every trade from a perspective of what is this team probably trying to do? What is this other team probably trying to do? In this trade, were they able to get what they were trying to get? If that's true, they both won. Like that's accurate. Even if like maybe we gave up the more productive player. Okay, but maybe what you were trying to do was reduce your salary this year to duck repeater tax and to open up cap space for the next summer where you project a strong opportunity to sign a particular free agent. Like a lot of it is again very nuanced trade-offs and stuff, right? And I the other aspect of timing that can make a deal fall apart can also make a deal happen. So like you might have a deal all set up and then a player gets injured who is about to be in that deal. This is why teams will often sit a player, a DMP, or cite some sort of vague illness or injury leading up to a potential trade because they don't want to risk that trade falling apart because of an injury or something like that. But on the flip side, timing also impacts greatly like how a trade comes together. So I don't know if y'all remember the Chauncey Billups and Antonio McDyess for Allen Iverson deal that happened like very early in the season. That deal was a year in the making. So the previous year's playoffs, even like the season before that, Carmelo had gotten a DUI during the playoffs. And so Denver's front office were just like bombarded by calls like, well, you got to trade Melo. Here's some shit. The Pistons were one of the teams that called. And Mark Orkentine, who was the GM of the Nuggets at the time, told Joe Dumars like, hey, we're not trading Melo. Not happening. But there are some guys on your team that we like. If you wind up, if there's anybody else on our team or a package of, players, picks, etc., that interests you, let me know. And, Rodney Stuckey had that great summer league. Detroit was really, really high on Rodney Stuckey, and they wanted to create some cap space for that upcoming free agent class. And so, they moved off of Chauncey Billups and Antonio McDyess's deals to take on Allen Iverson, who was on an expiring contract. And so Detroit got what they want, right? Like it ultimately didn't really work out because of how they use their salary cap space, but we can get into that in a little bit. But they wanted to free up cap space and they wanted to free up touches and a role for Stuckey. They did both things. And Denver got for Denver, they kind of realized, hey, it's tough having two ball stopping scorers. So like you can have a ball stopping scorer and have a good team offense. It's harder when you have two ball stopping scorers where they're just taking turns, which was AI and Melo. And so you get Chauncey Billups, who's going to defer to Melo as the scorer, but help run the offense, the team offense more. And it helps that he's a hometown guy. And that's the team that then went to the Western Conference Finals. So, timing can play a big role both in causing a trade to fall apart and also causing a trade to ultimately come together, even if it takes a while.
Yeah, I think when we evaluate trades too, I think everyone is quick to just immediately say, I'm going to grade this trade, right? Especially when we're dealing with trades like of draft picks or young players, oftentimes it'll be 4 or 5 years before we truly know who won a deal or, which side benefited more. And it's unfortunate because I don't think we're in the news cycle is such a now product that, we don't get a lot of, looking back and saying, okay, who did win this trade 4 or 5 years ago? I think an interesting one for me was the draft day trade that the Sixers and Suns made where Mikal Bridges was the 10th overall pick. And the Sixers ended up trading him for the 16th pick. And then they ended up drafting Zaire Smith with that pick. And they also got a future first. So pretty much everything I heard about that trade when it happened was, the Sixers just got so much value. They only had to drop 6 slots and they got another first. Like, what a great move by Philadelphia. But in hindsight, Mikal Bridges for Zaire Smith is quite awful. And then also they ended up just adding that additional first-round pick in a trade to get Tobias Harris. They might have just gotten Tobias Harris anyway had they not had that extra pick. And the Clippers would have just been like, we'll take it anyway because that's all the assets you have. So they didn't really get anything in addition to making that swap, and ended up being a terrible swap.
Yeah, I guess that's another thing I guess to talk about. It's like we talked about time, we talked about like hindsight and all of that. How do you look at trades that are more like trees? And when I say that, like one leads to let's look at Indiana, Oklahoma City. 2018 or 2018. Indiana traded Paul George, Oklahoma City for Victor Oladipo, Domantas Sabonis, right? Now, they didn't really. It looked at the time like Indiana got fleeced. Again, I'm a big fan of the ones that take hindsight being 2020. Because same thing with it wasn't as big as the Pau Gasol Lakers trade, but like it looked bad. Like Oladipo didn't look like a star at all. That kind of had faded in Orlando, and then in Oklahoma City, he looked like a really good Russell Westbrook sidekick. Sabonis shooting just 39% overall. Now, mind you, a lot of that was because not really a jump shooter, and with Russell Westbrook, it was going to be a jump shooter. There was no picks attached. It was literally just that. While George was a perennial all-star and NBA all-defensive selection, like all NBA all-defensive team selection, right? Like this looked like an uneven trade. Now, that being said, as it turned out, like George played some of his best basketball, continuing his best basketball. I'd say he played some of his best basketball in Oklahoma City. The highest he reached an MVP conversation, I think, was third in 2019. Mind you, only there 2 years. And yeah, it didn't really work out well for the Thunder in terms of their playoff hopes. Like they weren't a championship contender. They were in that second tier and they flamed out early in both seasons that Paul George played. As far as Indiana, like the Pacers skipped the rebuild altogether. Both Oladipo and Sabonis became all-stars, and that was great. But like honestly, as y'all both can tell, the bigger thing was what those deals spawned into. Because unfortunately, Oladipo battled injuries. That was a shame, and also a mess just how it unfolded for Indiana. And Sabonis had some really solid seasons with Indiana, so much so that they traded him to Sacramento and were able to get a guy like Tyrese Halliburton, who is one of the premier young talents of the league, in exchange for him. Like that's one extension of that trade, right? Whereas Oklahoma City, had Paul George, did okay. He played well, but they weren't going super far. Decided to blow it up. And traded him to the Clippers, and you get SGA, the 5 first-round picks, the 2 pick swaps. You also had Danilo Gallinari. But that was one of the bigger packages of picks and players for a single player. And so, yes, this one transaction, if you grade it on its face, I don't know how you look at it. But then you look at what that spawned in and of itself, and now look at the teams in this further evolution. built off of the initial trade in a way. I just think it's interesting and wanted to get your thoughts on trades like that.
Yeah, that PG for Sabonis and Oladipo move was, I thought it was a terrible move for the Pacers at the time. And I think one thing, I don't know how much you can give the team credit. Maybe they knew, but the idea of like the Pacers could have theoretically had scouted Sabonis and realized that, hey, he's playing out of position in Oklahoma City at the 4. And if we put him at the 5, he'll thrive, right? And, again, I don't know how much the Pacers deserve credit for like having that figured out ahead of time, or if they just kind of stumbled into that after the fact. But it certainly worked out for both sides. And of course, Corban, as you mentioned, the Thunder didn't necessarily do as well in the postseason with the Russ PG duo, but George played terrifically while he was with the Thunder, and then they also ended up shipping him for now Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and a ton of draft picks. So I think they're in pretty good shape a couple of moves out, and then the Pacers as well are, despite the fact that Oladipo, was hampered a ton with injuries, and after that third team All-NBA appearance was never the same. They still got some All-Star seasons from Sabonis, and now have a franchise cornerstone in Tyrese Halliburton.
Yeah, one little thing I wanted to add before kind of touching on what Corban was talking about. Yes, the Pacers probably noted that Domantas is playing out of position and is better as a center. And the problem, though, is that means they had to shift Miles Turner out of position and play as a power forward to space the floor for him. But this gets back to different teams value different things for different reasons, right? Like the Pacers probably had a better feeling about their evaluations of Oladipo and Sabonis, and they probably also had a strong sense of like, we feel we know like a good developmental plan for both of them that will help optimize, them, whether that's in different roles or in current roles. So that's all stuff that, again, factors into it. The other thing, touching on what Corban said, is I don't give credit for like, oh, but this pick they used 3 years later as part of this deal, which then gave them an asset that gave them the ability to do this deal another 4 years after that. Like, no. Each deal comes in its own context, right? Like, the league is potentially in a different context from the next trade. The Paul George deal, that was because Kawhi had leveraged the Clippers, and Sam Presti, who's really good at his job, was like, hey, we all know this isn't just for Paul George. This is for Paul George and Kawhi. And yes, I know you could just sign Kawhi as a free agent, but it seems to me like you need Paul George to do that. So you got to up the offer. And I've never been a fan, and most of my mentors, so I might be in the minority in the basketball world in terms of a lot of people just think like, oh, well, you can always make a deal. You could always trade something down the line. Like, get another star. You can always trade one of them down the line. I don't think trades are easy. And let's say somebody gets injured, or they have a bad slump, or maybe they don't get along with the coach. Like, Rondo's trade value before that deal to Dallas was way higher than if Dallas tried to trade Rondo after he was playing with them, right? So I think you have to evaluate each deal based on the context at the time. And yes, there's going to be some elements of like, okay, that player turned out really well. Marc Gasol turned out way better than I bet even Memphis had dreamed of. Does that necessarily make that deal better? Like, in hindsight, yes, but then when you're talking about, Sam still has some of those picks from the Clippers deal that came about from the Paul George, Victor Oladipo, Domantas Sabonis deal, that he's probably gonna use in a subsequent deal that we won't see for another year or two. Can you really give him credit? Like, watch, I bet this is gonna happen. Like, no. What it is it's giving you more, as Kevin Pritchard likes to say, more optionality. If we have more draft picks, if we have more young players who we think can develop in our system and get better trade value, that gives us more optionality. But you can't say, like, we knew we would trade this guy for an additional benefit, 2 seasons later. Like, I don't think you can say that.
I'm going to push back just a little bit. I think that it kind of is a factor. You don't make trades with picks. Like, obviously, teams change. There's a reason why you make trades and have picks that you look at years in the future that you prioritize when making the trade, because you don't know what that front office will look like, years down the line. And when that team is there, you can cash in on that opportunity. I definitely think it's a factor. I get what you mean. Like, I think at certain points it can be kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, like, some of it is that optionality. Like you said, you make these moves with the idea that something could happen and you cash in on that. That's why picks are a big deal. When the Pelicans and Lakers made that big trade with AD, like, you got, all the Lakers young players, and then you end up getting all these picks as well. Like, but ultimately the picks haven't really worked out in the Pelicans' favor. And at the time it was a whole big deal. I'm not saying it's like a given for sure, but I'm definitely not, it's not in my mind and not non-entity either. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle between that. I definitely don't dismiss it entirely. I definitely don't think it's all gold in terms of taking everything for what it is, but yeah, a lot of it is that. I mean, you're not making a trade for just this year, right? Like, on the one hand, it's like, you can't grade it out winners and losers immediately, but then again, you can't wait years down the line. No, I think there's something in the middle of that where you have to kind of evaluate it as it goes. And if it is directly related to the other thing, then maybe we didn't know that when the Pacers and Thunder made that trade, the Thunder were going to blow it up and reset 2 years later. Nobody saw that, right? Or that the Pacers would have Sabonis develop into an all-star. And it takes the right amount of development and the system and whatever the case may be. But I definitely think there's something to be said for that, especially when you look back. And that's even more so if you're not immediately going to make a winner and loser. Then it is a factor into looking back on why it may or may not have worked.
I think an interesting example or test case of kind of what we're talking about is what Brad Stevens did this offseason, where he traded Marcus Smart in a move and got Porzingis, right? And also got a couple of additional first-round draft picks, right, that added to the optionality he had at his disposal to make a subsequent move, which he ended up using, I think, one of those draft picks to then get Drew Holiday. So I do think it's I understand, Josh, where you're coming from, but I also think in a certain respect, like, getting those draft picks allows you then to potentially make a move down the road. And you're right that, we didn't know for sure that Drew Holiday was going to become available, right? And it kind of seemed to be the perfect fit because he could just kind of fill in that Marcus Smart role for that team. So they did get fortunate. They did get lucky, but at the same time, those draft picks did help them make a subsequent move beyond that initial trade of just adding Porzingis. And I guess also with the Celtics, they could look at that and say, well, we still have Derek White in house. So even though we've lost Smart, we still do have some perimeter defense at our disposal. But I guess I'm kind of in between the two of you where, I do believe that, adding that draft pick haul and some of your subsequent moves, you can kind of tie it back to that initial deal in some ways.
I just want to clarify. I'm not saying that, like, the draft picks can't be evaluated as part of the deal. I'm saying, like, in that particular context with the Victor Oladipo, Domantas Sabonis, you couldn't say, Like, we feel like we could trade Victor or DeMontis down the line for X number of picks. You might have some general census of how the rest of the league looks at those players. So you might have some understanding, like, yeah, we might be like, this player is probably going to be worth a first round pick, but not necessarily know where in the first round that might be. But like picks, the whole point of picks is they're not actually anything until they're used. So it's all about optionality, right? It's all about the flexibility of being lucky. So like, I agree with you guys when it comes with the picks. Like, I just want to clarify with that. I don't think like, oh, picks don't matter when you look at the like, no. Again, I evaluate trades on like, what was this team trying to do, and did they accomplish that in this deal? And like Boston, they didn't know that Drew was going to be available, but they wanted to open up a bigger role for Derek White, and they wanted to have more like optionality for swinging for somebody that they felt would, take that extra step, right? Which happened to be Drew. And even before knowing that Drew was going to be, that was a good deal, because like they did what they wanted to do, right? Get more opportunity and a bigger role for Derek White, get him starting while reducing some salary and adding a pick that, we might be able to use down the line. So that's how I'm coming at it. I just wanted to clarify so that people aren't like, Josh hates draft picks. No, draft picks are good. Although I will say one thing Mark always loved to say was, look at the box score. Tell me, future draft pick, how much did he score last night? How many rebounds did future draft pick get? Like, draft picks aren't a thing until they're actually a thing. So yeah, just wanted to clarify.
No, I definitely appreciate that. I get that. It's again, it speaks to the nuance of these types of discussions, right? When it comes to trades and just all of that. And I definitely, before we kind of wrap up, I wanted to get any final general thoughts that we had before we go into the free agency topic, because I know that is something that we have a lot of thoughts on. So real quick, any last little quick hits around this the panel here before we move on, or do you want to go straight to it? Going once, going twice. So this was a great segment on trades. I'm sure throughout the course of the year, as trades happen and such, we'll go back and kind of dive into some of these points, flesh out further some others, and have further discussions on that. But let's go to free agency, because that's another thing where fans, myself, everyone is big. Okay, this player can get this in free agency, and this player, this team can, run, the Lakers from between 2015 and 2018. Like, we get this guy and this guy. And it was like, we went from like Carmelo Anthony, LeBron James to like DeMar DeRozan and then Greg Monroe. And like, just all these guys ultimately end up with like Carlos Boozer and Jeremy Lin. And it's just so interesting in my mind about free agency and how that works in terms of, okay, you have a lot of money or you don't have a lot of money, and you are a team with a need. And this is the player that you look at, that you determine will fit that need. And whether they do or they don't, or they mesh with the rest of the surrounding infrastructure in place or not, I think there's so much discussion to be had there. So let's kind of kick it off. I'll throw it over to you, Josh, and throw it over to you, Garrett. But let's kind of talk about free agency, and I guess what we think of that as obviously as a factor in team building, as obviously a common method, and the strengths and weaknesses of that as we kind of start this conversation here.
Yeah, free agency, in my opinion, is more like trades than the draft, in the sense that there's a reason teams prefer building through the draft, because you have the most control with the draft. You don't necessarily need to get the player and their representatives aligned with you. You should, but you don't necessarily need to do that. Whereas with a trade, like we mentioned, you got to get a lot of people aligned with you, and it has to align to the rules. With free agency, you have to sell that player on the opportunity, the role, the money, the years, the environment, the developmental context, the nightlife, whatever. you have to actually get that player to buy into it and their agent to do it. And it's not like you can generally offer way more than another team can. Sometimes that's true, but most of the time you're hindered by the rules, right? Like, hey, another team, if they have the same amount of cap space, can offer this guy the exact same amount. So it's up to you to sell that player and their representative on, here's why we're the best option for you. And inherent in that is, you don't have as much certainty as you do with the draft. And that makes free agency really interesting, right? Because it's not so clear cut. Some years it is. We knew Lonzo was going to the Bulls. We knew Jalen Brunson was going to the Knicks. We know some of these things. But, I think sometimes teams and their fan base, the Lakers fan base in that stretch, was particularly annoying because they were like, we're going to sign everybody, even though, like, you can't. Like, the rules, you can't. Or like the Knicks, for instance. The Knicks as an organization have long run on the idea that, like, Madison Square Garden is the Mecca. If we have cap space, free agents will sign with us because it will turn on the vacancy sign and people will sign with us. And if you go back and you actually look, they traded for Melo. They didn't sign him in free agency. So we don't know 100% if Melo actually would have signed there. He probably would have, but we don't know for sure. And there was a lot of talk, like, we're going to get LeBron. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And, like, ultimately, the best free agents they ever got were Amari Stoudemire and Allen Houston, who are all-stars, mind you. But, like, when your organizational perspective is like, we can turn this vacancy sign on and people flock to us, and this was reflected in, draft picks that they gave up to take on Andrea Bargnani from the Raptors and stuff, because, like, the draft, we can get free agents to come to us. We're New York. It's the Mecca. And look at the Lakers, right? Like, yes, they got Shaq. Outside of Shaq, who's the best free agent the Lakers have signed? Obviously LeBron, but there's other stuff like Shaq and LeBron. Yes. But again, Lakers and Lakers fans act like same thing, like with the Knicks. Like, we can turn on a vacancy sign and people are going to flock to us. And, like, with LeBron, he wanted to dip his toes more into Hollywood stuff. And, like, let's be honest. Sorry, Garrett. I'm guessing that I haven't been to Cleveland, but I'm guessing that LA is just a much nicer place to live than Cleveland in general, in terms of weather, that sort of stuff. So there's this, like, uncertainty with free agency that makes it very interesting.
Yeah, and I think another key element of free agency, at least with, like, the recent development of free agency, is, and this has changed in part because of some changes in the CBA, but more players are signing extensions now. We've got it most recently with Giannis signing his extension and not becoming a free agent, right? It used to be back in the days where the Heatles came together. It was like almost every superstar goes to free agency because it wasn't, there wasn't enough of an incentive with the extension structure to actually extend ahead of time. So everybody went to free agency. So that allowed more teams to feel like, okay, we can at least get their ear and get a chance at all the top guys when their contract runs out, right? Whereas now it seems like there's not really too many star players that are getting to that point. And you look at a team like the Houston Rockets, who had all the cap space in the world this past offseason, and they ended up spending it on Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks, and also we're targeting Brook Lopez. All those guys are starting caliber players, but they're not superstars, right? So I think, GMs have to start sort of changing their mindset with free agency now as well, and think like, we might have to overpay for starters as opposed to get max superstars now. And that's where someone like Daryl Morey, I think, is in a decent place with Philadelphia, where they've got theoretically the stars in Embiid and Maxey. And if they add 2 quality starters like the Rockets did this past offseason to that nucleus, they could be a pretty darn good team. But it is a different sort of philosophy, a different strategy to free agency now than it was, say 10 years ago.
Speaking of 10 years ago, I'm playing. The 2016 free agency was actually like 8 years ago, but it's getting there. 7. But point being, no, I agree with you. First off, before we even move on with the blast from the past case study here, I do have to say I totally agree with you, Garrett. Like, it is changing, right? A lot of between the collective bargaining agreement, a lot of the way that teams are, constructing, a lot of the way that free agents or future free agents are, it's easier to get that extension and go for a trade from there, right? And then get traded where they want to go with the leverage that they have there. And that has like changed free agency. And we'll see whether it like corrects itself, what the case may be. If you look at free agency, coming up this upcoming year, if you look at the top free agents, most of them are pretty set, you would think, to either go back to the original team with an extension, a renegotiation, whatever the case may be, or they're just not big, players that are really going to be a factor. And when I say that, I mean, you look at Kawhi Leonard, right? Like, honestly, and that's going to be interesting. Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and Clippers, interesting to see what happens there. So let's put a pin in that. But like Pascal Siakam, Tyrese Maxey, LeBron James, James Harden, Drew Holiday, OG Anunoby, DeMar DeRozan, Nick Claxton, like, and then Klay Thompson. Like, the more you get down, I mean, it's not even really 10 deep in terms of like real impact players. Maybe because of where they are age-wise, whether they are what they've done production-wise, it's just not, we're not seeing the 2010 free agents, back with that class, or what was the last big free agency class I'm trying to think of? I'm just going to stop at 2010. There's another one. I can't think about it, but the point being, you're right. And like Josh pointing out in the chat, you definitely maximize your earnings by extending instead of going to free agency. And so it has subtly changed that. And we see some of the ramifications of that early right now. But looking at it from a team perspective, and I hate to bring it up, but I don't hate to bring it up, that 2016 free agency, like, it was big because of the money that was around, right? And teams had money to spend. But what made it interesting was where they chose to spend that money, right? What players they decided to kind of give that money to, what they thought these players would do to kind of fix their team or fill a need, and the disastrous effects that kind of spilled out of that. And so, I mean, I there's a few here. There's so many here. You can go with Joakim Noah to New York. I'm going to go with the Lakers, of course, and we can just kind of go from there. But if you look at the Lakers, I mean, this was a team that, Kobe had just retired, I want to say. Yeah. 2016. Yes, he had just retired because Timofey Mozgov and Luol Deng did not play with Kobe. That's how I remember. Point being, like, they were a rebuilding team. They just gotten Brandon Ingram. You had D'Angelo Russell. You had Jordan Clarkson. You were a young group. Lonzo Ball wasn't there. That hadn't been that team, but you had a lot of money. Young rebuilding Lakers squad, and they decided to go and spend 4 years, $72 million on Luol Deng, and 4 years, $64 million on Timofey Mozgov. And so, yeah, I mean, Mozgov was pretty clear almost immediately that, his fit in the modern NBA was gone. So much so the Lakers had to trade him with a young asset in D'Angelo Russell to Brooklyn. Like, they had to attach that contract in order to make that work. And within 2 years of signing the contract, Mozgov was out of the league. And then Luol Deng, rapid decline, unfortunately, but also, like, yeah, the Lakers got $7.5 million back when they bought him out, but this contract was horrible. It seemed a decent, little bit ambitious to sign a player like Deng for this young team, but it didn't work out at all. I mean, he just played 57 games with the Lakers in 2 seasons before the buyout, played 1 year with the Timberwolves, and was gone. Like, so that's a lot of money for 2 rotation level players coming into that season that didn't produce at all. And there's so many more to go into, but like, I guess what I'll ask either of you, because it's been, I don't know, like I said, almost 7 years. I still know what the Lakers were thinking. Like, when you look at some of these teams and decisions that were made, what did you think these teams were looking at? Like, oh, we have the money, let's throw it at them without even like evaluating the fit. Was it really just just a monstrous collective misevaluation of players from teams across the league? Was it we just have the money and this guy could be decent for us, but instead of giving him like $4 million, we're going to give him $40 million? Like, what do you think were some of the factors that led to this gross, this gross, I don't know, just gross. I'm just going to leave it there. Led to this grossness.
Yeah, some of it is just, we got to spend the money. Josh mentioned in our DM over here that it was a $24.1 million bump in the salary cap. So teams had to spend a certain amount of money to reach the floor, right? And so there's that. And then, you also get the element of, okay, well, we have to outpay these guys, or we have to pay these guys a certain amount more than their market value would suggest, because every team this offseason, because of that bump, has money, right? So it became a situation where when everyone had that excess cash, that everyone was getting overpaid. I remember the story of like when Evan Turner got his contract offer from the Blazers, he called his friend Andre Iguodala and told him the figure, and Andre Iguodala just told him, sign that right now. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's an element of, the teams just had to spend the money, right? But then there is also this idea too of, and Mozgov gets a lot of harsh criticism because, he obviously, that was a bad contract and all that. I got to say, though, got to point this out. Mozgov was really great in the 2015 NBA Finals. People forget about that, but the guy balled out in that series. It was a terrible contract and all that. But, when you're looking at it from the Lakers' perspective, I think, Brandon Ingram was just drafted or was just about to be drafted. And so, you get a guy like Luol Deng who had played just a ton of minutes under Tom Thibodeau. Tom Thibodeau ran his players into the ground in Chicago. And you've got a guy in Mozgov who I believe was in his late 20s as well and had some minutes under his belt. The guy is like, if you were a more competitive team, maybe that would make sense if those guys ended up holding up and maintaining their level from previous years, which they didn't do that either. It would have made some sense. But with a team where you've got you're rebuilding and you're in a phase where let's try to get D'Angelo Russell and Brandon Ingram up to speed, it really didn't make a lot of sense. There was a lot of issues with the deals and a lot of issues with what a lot of teams were doing. But that bump, that being such an unprecedented thing, I think led to a lot of mistakes just because it wasn't something that a lot of GMs had experience dealing with.
Which just highlights that free agency, which is something you can prepare for in the sense of like, we've made sure we have enough cap space for like a max salary slot or something like that. You can prepare for free agency, but there's different contexts for the free agency. Like maybe you're in a situation like 2016, and we might see this in I think 2025, where a new media rights deal just happened and revenues are going up, and that's going to impact the bottom line. Although I believe the NBA Players Association will probably agree to cap smoothing this time. But like beyond that, there's the different context year to year of like who might actually be, like it might be a shallow talent pool in free agency because X number of guys are probably just going to extend. And then you have to trade for them, which is a totally different construct than signing them with a free agent offer sheet, because you actually have to give up draft picks. You have to give up players. You have to give up contracts to match this. And so not like every free agency period is a different free agency period, just like every draft is a different draft. Every trade deadline is a different trade deadline, which is partially why I don't like, the the trade tree, like, 5 trades from now, this worked out, like, and because of that, free agency in situations like 2016, like Garrett said, completely unknown context. Like, every team had cap space and had like plentiful cap space at the time. So you get situations like where Kevin Durant goes to the Warriors, and we know the impact that had. You get situations where, it's also a domino effect, right? So I forget who signed first, but like Timofey Mozgov, Hassan Whiteside, Al Jefferson, they all kind of signed biggish deals at the time, and whoever signed first, that just sets like the other players' agents to be like, hey, Hassan Whiteside just got 4 years, $98 million. Mozzie's at least, 2/3 as good. So, it becomes this like domino effect where, okay, yeah, we might have been willing to accept X number, but guess what? DJ Augustine just got 29 million. Or Jeremy Lin got 36 million. Our price is up now. And so even in free agency, like the context of that particular free agency period factors in very heavily. And in 2016, it really screwed the Lakers over and the Knicks and a few others. And I think it was more due to the context than it was necessarily misevaluations. Like Garrett alluded to, you have to hit 90% of the salary cap to meet the salary floor. So you have to spend that money anyway. Another thing teams think about, and this is how kind of the Blazers approached Evan Turner and also the offer sheet that they dropped on Enes Kanter, which wasn't this season, this free agency, but I think like the next, where, okay, either if it's an offer sheet, either the other team matches it and we just screwed up their cap space, or we think this is a tradable deal. Even if we don't necessarily think this player is worth it, we think it's tradable. Which, again, like I've said, is a little risky for my taste. It's a little risky to be like, this player would be totally healthy. They'll be totally productive, and we can flip them down the line. It's possible, but it's also possible that they will not be. So,
yeah, and that's where, again, depending on the context of your team, like if you're a team that's a contender, it might make sense to overpay for a guy to keep him as opposed to just losing him for nothing, which would take you out of contender status, right? But like if you're in a situation where you're the Lakers in that 2016 offseason, they're not contenders, they're a rebuilding team. There's no reason to overpay for guys that not only are not a part of the timeline of the young core, but they're not going to get you anywhere that is helpful. I think worst case scenario, they make you like just good enough that you hurt your own draft pick, but you still miss the playoffs, So that was the other thing that I think a lot of teams got wrong with that unprecedented situation was, okay, if you need to get to the salary floor and you need to overpay some guys to actually get them to get them to come to convince them, then do it for 1 year, right? And even you could even make it more inflated for that season, but it's the 3 and 4 year deals that really killed a lot of those teams and really set teams back in that 2016 offseason.
that gets back to like everybody having cap space though, right? So like you could get the same 1 year offer from another team. And so one other differentiation factor you can have when making a free agent offer is like, hey, we'll give you more years. You have more years locked in. You can also, and the reverse happens some years too, right? Like sometimes the players want a player option or a team option after like 1 or 2 seasons so that they have the flexibility to get back into free agency once they hit the next level of experience where they can get a higher starting salary. But yeah, like that's one of the things that did mess up a lot of these teams is there was so much money available that the competition for at least I still honestly don't understand Mozgov, and not dunking on Mozgov. I think he was a solid guy. But like Mozgov and Evan Turner, for example, because we've mentioned them, are other teams maybe offering them a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal? And so the Lakers and the Blazers are like, we'll give you 4 to make sure that we get you. Which, again, if your goal is to get those guys, or at least players like those guys who have skill sets you think your team needs, and you can guarantee, like, okay, we got one. Are you willing to overpay a little bit? But are you also willing to overpay in terms of contract length, not just salary?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating thing. Like, again, I have no insider experience here, so maybe Josh, you know a little bit more. But in terms of like the teams having some sort of an idea of like, okay, we're going to set a bar as to like, okay, if this contract gets over this point, we're no longer interested, right? And I feel like a lot of teams in that 2016 offseason didn't have that bar, and that was a big problem. But that's something where, again, it depends on the context of where you are as a team, but there has to be an element of like, you should have somebody in the analytics department or whatever, like figuring out, okay, what is this guy's general value, and, how much over that are we willing to go to get him based on where we're at as a team. And, again, I think a lot of teams failed to do that in 2016 in particular.
Yeah, that 2016 historic for all the wrong reasons. But I think also like, all the wrong reasons in terms of like actual contracts and all the things we saw, right? But also like it does show, okay, and we'll see this again with more money coming in. Granted, free agency has changed between then and now. And that's just, part of the evolution of the league and also how teams adapt and maybe not making the same mistakes. But I guess we went kind of micro, let's kind of go macro. What are some of the bigger issues that y'all see in free agency from teams? Whether, like, for example, for me, it's using free agency to like mess up an identity of a team too quickly. Like, okay, we see a player that we want, and doesn't really matter where our team is in its current rebuilding phase. We're going to take this player and we're going to go from there. And I look at, I hate to go back to 2016, but actually, no, I'm not going to go to 2016. I think I'm going to go, one of these will trade. But if you look at, let's talk about Chicago. There you go. Chicago, that's a good one. Thank you, Josh. In the chat, where you had a team that was basically going to rebuild. And we hadn't seen that happen, and it was long overdue for Chicago. They had just finished the whole Jimmy Butler thing. They kind of had Zach LaVine and like Mark. It was just a weird phase for this team. And instead they said, okay, no, we're gonna go for a team that, I'm not gonna lie, on paper was fun for the half the season they played together, where they got Lonzo Ball and you get DeMar DeRozan. You have the trade, of course, for Nikola Vucevic alongside Zach LaVine. Now we all know, like, ultimately that team was not going to be a finals contender, right? Or even an Eastern Conference finals contender. It was really just a playoff team. But like the Bulls were comfortable with that. And unfortunately, Lonzo goes down, has been out the last 2 years. DeMar DeRozan in his mid-30s now has regressed. You could say Zach LaVine. So is Nikola Vucevic. Zach LaVine's just kind of stalled out, and this team is horrific. In fact, they've been playing recently better as of late, but notice that Zach LaVine has not been on the floor, and they have had to do more of a team basketball style with DeMar DeRozan passing the ball a lot more, playing, around around Vooch a little bit, not making him the centerpiece, but playing out of that. And it's been interesting. And it does kind of lend itself to a little bit of that Ewing theory, which I've always hated, but that's a totally different story. But what do y'all think as far as just, that's my big thing about free agency and teams making moves because they have the cap space to do so, and the players going to take the money. In most cases, it depends, but maybe not being the ideal fit or the ideal marriage between both player and team because of where both are respectively.
Yeah, I think the Bulls situation where, trading for DeRozan and Vucevic, it was just a complete mismanagement and a lack of understanding of where the team was prior to the trades and also where they would be after the trades, right? It's it's a little bit of a simple way to think about things, but the goal of the NBA is to win the championship. That's what these teams should be striving to accomplish, and what the Bulls essentially did with those trades was put themselves in position to be the 7th seed in the East and lose in the first round. And they sent out like 3+ future first round picks to do so. And they even got a career season out of DeMar DeRozan, like a first team All NBA caliber season out of DeMar DeRozan. And they still were, I think, the 6th seed. So, and got destroyed in the playoffs by the Milwaukee Bucks. So even when you make trades and that player excels in your team and in your system and you're still not good enough, that just goes to show you that the trade itself and your own understanding of where you were at was completely misguided. And that's where a lot of teams really, really struggle. And I also think there's a fascinating sort of thing with when you factor free agency and trades together. And I think where Toronto has really screwed up in recent seasons, like where you've got Fred VanVleet, and I think a lot of teams would have offered some pretty decent packages to get VanVleet at last year's trade deadline. The Raptors, despite the fact that they weren't a contender last year, chose to hold on to him, but then didn't back it up by paying him in the offseason and letting him walk. It's those things in concert at times that can just be completely confounding, where it's like, I don't know really what you're thinking. Either you want to keep the guy or you don't. You can't keep him when it, negatively impacts you because you're not getting assets for him, and then not want him when it really kills you and he could just leave for nothing. It's, teams just have to, again, we've talked about this in other pods, communicating and having a true and honest discussion about where you are as a franchise, and then making the moves based off of that. If there's confusion, if there's a lack of understanding on that front, that's where these mistakes happen.
I can't agree more. Like that's the root cause of a lot of disconnect, if you will, that we see, whether it's free agency, trades, etc. And with free agency, let's be honest, it's very similar to like when we got the stimulus checks, or when you get like a tax refund. Like when you have money, you tend to want to spend it. Like it's the marshmallow test, right? Like, I could eat this marshmallow right now. I could have 2 marshmallows if I wait. I could use this cap space to, take in distressed assets and get an extra pick or something like that. But a lot of teams don't have that patience unless they're like a rebuilding team, like Oklahoma City or Utah in the last couple of seasons, where like we're cool. We don't need to sign like players necessarily to this cap space. We're going to use this to kind of finance our way to get extra draft picks and stuff. But with other teams, like the other factor in this, and with free agency, it actually is potentially easier than with trades, and sometimes even with the draft, because with the draft, unless you got a guaranteed, like we got a top 5 pick and there's 6 players in this draft class people love. There's uncertainty with trades and the draft in terms of like being able to win that press conference, right? With free agency, assuming you can get the player to agree, which sometimes means overpaying, whether that's in terms of dollar amount, seasons of contract, or promised role, etc. You can practically guarantee that you're going to have a good press conference. You know, like we signed so-and-so. We just added a star. He was an all-star last year. We added a star. Clap it up. Everybody love it. Everybody. Does it make sense for our team? Hell no. But it's fun. It's fun, everybody. Clap. And like I'm making it into a joke, but that shit does matter to people in the league. A lot of people don't necessarily have the type of personality to constantly fly in the face of the media and the fans. Like Sam Hinkie, for instance, was one of those guys who's like, I don't care what you think. I'm trying to do my job. I don't care what you think. And that's partially what got him fired, honestly. But like, again, when you have money, you tend to want to spend it. And if it can help generate good buzz for you, your organization, etc., that can help sell season tickets. That can help do this and this, especially if it's a situation like we're alluding to where like maybe we shouldn't be doing this because we should be focusing on like rebuilding or something like that. But we still need to sell season tickets. So if we win this press conference, we might sell enough season tickets and maybe this player will have us competitive, but will still suck enough to get like a good draft pick.
I mentioned earlier the whole idea of, teams often get themselves in trouble by giving more years out to certain players. But I think on the cheaper end of the spectrum, I think it's actually a positive thing to do a lot of times where, you look at a guy like Malik Monk, the fact that the Sacramento Kings had a second year on that relatively cheap contract ended up paying huge dividends for them this season because they're, Malik Monk outplayed his contract last year. And if he was a free agent, if he just got a 1-year deal, he would have gotten a balloon payment. He might no longer be on the Kings. So that's where, when you look at like, in that situation in 2016, or when teams have a little bit of extra money that they could spend, I think teams too often go to the high end and overpay a really, a higher level player. They should try to take more flyers and give a 3 or 4 year deal that's slightly above the minimum that still doesn't really hurt you in terms of your salary cap. But if that player ends up panning out and you can have him for multiple seasons on a cost-controlled contract, it can really help your, building that back end of the roster.
Yeah, speaking of that, I like for example, I mean, the Lakers are kind of like players around the margins, right? And maybe like how you construct a team with that. I think the Lakers have done this the last couple of years when you look at guys, like Malik Monk, like Lonnie Walker, like guys who, appreciated assets, that for whatever reason, honestly, just players that didn't have the right fit in my mind, right? It wasn't like they were bad people. They just didn't have the right fit. They come in, they're in a system that showcased their strength. You could look at what they're doing now with Cam Reddish and boom, like see what happens, right? Now, these are more individual cases, but then another team I'd look at that's made moves like that this season that I've loved in terms of their free agency is the Brooklyn Nets. I thought they did the same thing when you look at Dennis Smith Jr., when you look at aforementioned Lonnie Walker, like these players that kind of, they're not major moves, but they gave them decent contracts to players that have, on the up for whatever reason, either didn't find the right role in their team, injuries, whatever that case happened, reclamation projects, if you want to say that, but they have been contributing really well for a Brooklyn Nets team that has had, they've made the most of their money with those players. And I think there's something to be said for that. So yeah, I definitely see a little bit where you're going with that, Garrett. I think I'm on the right path, but I like that thought for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, your Lonnie Walker example, it's just a 1-year deal though, right? So he's
true.
he's playing really good for them, and they're getting a ton of value for this 1 year. But say they paid him a little bit extra to get that to be a 2 or 3 year contract. That would look really great right now. And maybe he would have signed that if they upped the annual value to 5 to 10 million per year, as opposed to the minimum around 2.3 that he's getting. I mean, I do agree that it's still a solid signing that they got him, but that's where I'm kind of getting at is I don't think teams do enough of the idea of like, okay, we'll give them a little bit more. Maybe we'll give them the mid-level, or we'll use one of our exceptions and use multiple seasons to get a guy that, maybe his track record hasn't been at that level, but he's shown some signs. He's shown flashes. He's young, and maybe he'll outplay this contract.
Like the Hinkie special? Is that what we're kind of referring to? I'm being funny. That was a bad joke that didn't land. The Hinkie special, whatever. Everyone's know. Josh, did you have a point to add?
Yeah, kind of building upon what Garrett's saying, you also want to be able to provide yourself with early bird rights at the very least. So these 1 year deals, they work in certain contexts, right? Like a lot of Phoenix's rotation are on 1 year deals or on deals where there's like a team option or a player option on the second year. But if you do feel confident, like we think this player can be good in our system for what we want them to do, and like the money, like we might pay a little bit more than market value, but not to a painful degree, not to a net negative degree. If you give them 2 seasons, you at least have early bird rights. So if they do well, you have advantages in signing them back. And if you sign them to a 3 year deal, you then get full bird rights, which give you even more advantages. So like that is a factor. And I agree with Garrett. I think too often it's focused on the like stars or players we think can be maybe stars, and not enough on like the Kyle Andersons of the world, where we're like, he's really good and he's going to fit exactly what we need him to fit. But because we're putting so much money allocated towards like the players we think might be stars, it leaves us little room to offer like slightly above market value on, like 2 or 3 year deals for, what most people call role players. I prefer to call them complementary players, but because everybody's a role player, a scoring is a role. Let's be honest. So like when you call a player a role player, it's just meant to be derogatory. That's the whole point, is like, this player's not a scorer. But anyway, tangent aside, what Garrett's alluding to is a key part of roster construction. Like if you can, we talked about optionality earlier with draft picks and that sort of stuff. Having players like a Malik Monk, like a Lonnie Walker, like a Dennis Smith Jr. on a 2 or 3 year deal where you're also getting some form of bird rights on them. And, it again, like Garrett said, it's a deal that's maybe above market value, but it's not a painful deal. It's not a 2016 deal. That's another key way to really boost your rotation and like solidify yourself as a good team, especially when we know that injuries are a pretty impactful thing in the NBA, and having a deep bench of players who can contribute, and then being able to take advantage of them doing well in that role, it's good business.
That's true. Again, I think we've kind of gotten a good flesh out so far of at least at this point. This is a conversation that we'll be having ongoing, so it's not an end all be all. This is it. But just as we did with trades, we're done. We're cutting off. No, but just as we did with trades, do we have any last kind of thoughts or major points or even minor points that we want to kind of touch on real quick before we end this one. This was a really good deep dive conversation as expected with the three of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's again going back to like what we were just talking about the giving your complementary pieces a little bit more of money and over multiple years to try to keep them around. Like that's the thing that happened with like Bruce Brown and the Nuggets, right? Like it was a great signing because he did help them win a championship, right? But then they didn't have the capacity without the bird rights to keep him on their roster, and so that's hurt them this year. I think we use this word a lot, but when it comes to free agency, trades, draft picks, all of it, context matters. Where you are as a team, where you're headed, what's the situation with the other teams that you're dealing with. We talked about the on the court product, the locker room product. There's so much to consider. There's the financial element, the CBA element. And as Josh said, like trades aren't easy. It's not just going to always fall in your lap. There's not going to be some just like very simple Sabonis for Halliburton deal that often. But it's always, and that's why it's so fascinating to discuss, and that's why we can talk about it for as long as we have, because there's so many interesting factors that are at play, and why GM being a GM of an NBA team is one of the most difficult jobs in all of professional sports.
Well said. This also reminded me of a trade, and one I don't think we've actually discussed much on any podcast, but all the smoke that was like Donovan Mitchell will go to the Knicks, right? And then he wound up with the Cavs. And the difficulty in making trades, actually, if you're clever about it, and if you're really trying to get into the space of all the teams involved, and you understand like certain teams aren't aligning priorities to be able to do a trade, as a media person, you can actually predict trades better if you view it from the like trades are difficult to pull off perspective, because there was all that smoke for New York, right? Just because Donovan's from that area, he seemingly wants to play for the Knicks. The Knicks, in theory, have stuff to offer, but do the Knicks have what Danny Ainge wants? And if you look at, like, if you did a census of other NBA teams and you looked and you saw, okay, well, the Cavs, they already have Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, and Jared Allen. They already have three guys under 25 who they probably feel very confident in. You already have your young core. Are draft picks going to be pulling teeth for you as they are for other teams, right? When you have that young core in place, you feel more comfortable being like, yeah, we'll throw in an extra pick or two because we already have a young core and we can add Donovan Mitchell. So if you approach, particularly if you're a media person, or if you just like to be the resident NBA nerdstradamus with your friends, which is something I used to be at work in college. I actually predicted that Chauncey Billups trade to my friends 2 days before it happened, because I knew the Nuggets probably wanted to move off Allen Iverson. I knew that Chauncey was a hometown guy. I knew that the Pistons wanted to clear cap space and opportunity for Rodney Stuckey. It makes sense, right? If you view it as, oh, well, all 29 teams are going to give offers, like with the Damian Lillard stuff. Oh, well, like you could, there's going to be multiple offers better than Miami. I guarantee you there weren't that many offers besides Miami, Milwaukee, and maybe two more. Like there weren't a lot of offers. And so you have to kind of view things for what these teams are trying to do. Same way, like I said, how I evaluate trades and free agency and even the draft to a certain extent. What is the team trying to accomplish? And did their decision, whatever it may be, get them closer to accomplishing that? It might not be a good value. And I hope you all can hear the air quotes when I say value, because all value is relative. It only matters, did you do what you wanted to do? Did you accomplish what you were trying to do? And like Garrett said, and we've talked about in past podcasts, if you're truly honest about where you are as a team and an organization in regards to where you want to go, then you shouldn't care whether you win the trade or you get a good draft grade or you get a good free agency grade. You should care about doing what you need to do. And I think that's where we see teams fall prey to weird circumstances like the 2016 free agency bump and other stuff.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Damian Lillard trade because, we probably should discuss the most important trade that we've had in the last year in this podcast.
Probably should, maybe, yeah.
But I think the thing that was so interesting about the discourse about that deal, or at least the potential Miami-Portland elements of that deal, was the idea that Portland might not get a better offer. And you're probably right, Josh, that outside of Milwaukee and maybe one other team, there might not have been better offers. But what people failed to understand is okay, but Portland still has the leverage of just holding on to Damian Lillard and just waiting it out. And the team can also decide, okay, well, this deal they're giving us, even if we're not getting a better deal, is still not worth it to us. And the team that actually had the time pressure to get Damian Lillard in-house was the Miami Heat. And they were the ones acting like there was no pressure in the world. And, I think part of that thought process and that mindset led to them not getting Damian Lillard. So that was the thing that was frustrating me throughout that whole process, was this idea that all the pressure was on Portland and they've got to make the deal, when I thought it was the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. You're right. Again, how the leverage play, you look at, okay, well, certain teams sit in the backseat, you got to come to us. And they might be wrong. They might have that totally miscalculated. You know what I mean? I guess it's almost like dating. You got to come to me. I'm the catch. It's there's other options. This is different. I think you're right. That's a perfect kind of example of encapsulation of leverage and the perception of leverage, the perception of said leverage. Because, Miami Heat up and down thought, okay, well, we're the only ones in the market. We just got to sit back and just make it happen. You don't ain't gonna talk to us. That's fine. We'll wait. And they waited and they have been still waiting. You know what I mean? So there is something to be said for that. And I think that's a big thing when it comes to trades that you're right, we didn't really touch on. Not just leverage, because that on its own is its own principle in trades. I think the second minor sub principle would be the perception of that leverage.
Because things are always changing, right? Teams and their goals are always changing. Circumstances change. I think the thing that changed for Milwaukee was the ownership, the management realized that, Giannis isn't signing an extension. He still wants us to make moves to improve the roster. And it was a similar pressure that the Bucks front office felt that the Clippers felt when they traded for PG to get both him and Kawhi. It's this move for Damian Lillard might help us keep Giannis. So that's another thing that, as Portland, especially when they had a ton of leverage because Damian Lillard had 4 years left or whatever on his contract, that they could say, well, we can wait. And even if there's not another offer now, in 6 months or in 6 days, something might change. A team might have a player get hurt, and all of a sudden, Damian Lillard makes perfect sense for them. That's the thing, is Portland had no reason to rush, and I think they ended up getting a far better deal from Milwaukee, that package, than they would have gotten from Miami had they just said, well, we're just going to take this because I guess this is all we have. It's like, no. When you have a player that's under contract for multiple seasons, wait for a deal that you feel is of commensurate value for your franchise.
Sounds just about fair enough to me. Yeah, I think some of that is the waiting, especially when you brought up the media game. I think that certain teams, there is some impact of that, some pressure of that, whether perceived or implied about, the media trend of, well, this player's disgruntled. Well, maybe we should move here. It kind of feeds into it. I don't think it's for nothing that we see some teams that say, oh, we're going to wait it out. We saw Philadelphia say with James Harden, right? We've seen Portland do it with Dame. We've seen, I'm trying to think of the last 2 or 3 trades. The posturing has been, yeah, no, we ain't gonna rush. We'll make it happen. And then sure enough, there's a rush. And sure enough, a trade ends up happening sooner than later, right? So yeah, I think that's something to be taken into consideration as well when you look at the different components and factors that go into trades or near trades. But yeah, this has been another solid episode here. Roster Reconstruction, almost 2 hours on trades and free agency. And there's a lot to cover. And I just want to thank y'all, as always, for getting up here and hamming it up for a bit here. I think it's another insightful, fun discussion, and sure there's many more to come here. But before we roll out and end this episode, you already know how it go. Josh, Garrett, please plug yourselves, your work, all the nice things that y'all do. And y'all both too nice, so we'll let Garrett go first on this one.
All right. You can find me on Twitter at Garrett Bugay. That's GarrettBugay. You can also follow my podcast, also on basketball, called Duncan Dynasty, Dunkin Dynasty. And I also wanted to shout out a project that I was involved in recently. It's not in the basketball realm, but it's in the general media sphere. A buddy of mine has a podcast called Critical Diversions. And he just recently, last year we did basically a video games during COVID, like online magazine, where we had a bunch of different people contribute and write little essays on their favorite games that they played during that period. And then we recently turned it into like an audio version. So I went and did a voiceover and read my piece. And I also did some fun DJ drops as well for that episode. You can find that podcast again at Critical Diversions. The episode is 101.7 Crit Div FM. And you can also check out Critical Diversions on Twitter at Crit_Diversions.
That's pretty sick. Thanks for sharing that with us, Garrett.
Honestly, that sounds awesome, dude. I'm looking it up right now. You could find me on Twitter, but I'm not really doing much right now. I'm trying to avoid the toxicity of it for a little bit. But I do help people who want to work in the basketball industry or who want to take the next step in their journey in the basketball industry, kind of develop strategies, approaches, practices that help them get closer to their dream job in basketball. So if that's something that sounds intriguing to you, you can email me at josh@myhoopscareer.com and we can set up a phone call. We can do a little consultation, see where you're at, give you some ideas on where to go. And then if it's something where like maybe you want some more hands-on type stuff, I also do like an actual like career coaching client type thing for some people as well. So
both Garrett and I can both attest to the value that Josh brings, both from his experience and also having been recipients of that call, and hopefully future ones to go as far as advice and just kind of finding our way in this great crazy basketball sphere. So definitely make sure to check out Josh on that. Might run you mad with this team building. Just kidding. Josh is awesome. I love you, man. And honestly, like,
Corban mad.
I'm the only irrational hoops fan, so yes. But no, on a very real note, like if you're trying to find your footing, Josh has consulted with so many different people, including, like I said, ourselves and people I know, and trying to help find our space here. So definitely something I would recommend. I don't have the cool projects that Garrett has to offer, nor, the consulting advice. But what I do have is a great voice, a good personality. You can find all that on Twitter /X/whatever at Corban NBA. Make sure to check that out. Definitely appreciate that. We have Roster Reconstruction here, which is really more of an ensemble cast. So I like to share credit for that. Ramble is my little baby. And so that's a show that we'll be kind of going more regular on because we are back home and now in a semi-stable releasing schedule. So that'll be a thing. And then I will be dabbling with some writing. I said that for half a year and I will say it until I do it. So there we go with that. But listen, y'all, this has been another great episode. Definitely make sure to check out Switch Theory on Twitter at Switch Theory, online, switchtheory.com. Great writing, great scouting work. Like, it's a really cool place of devoted folks who love hoops. So definitely make sure to look into that. And now we will close out for Josh, for Garrett, for myself. We are Frosty. Y'all stay frosty. We will meet up and talk with y'all real soon. All right, y'all.